Will you marry my mom? You're asking me to marry your mother? The man's voice carried genuine shock, the kind that slipped out before a person had time to control it. For several seconds, Ethan Carter simply stared at the ring resting in the center of his palm, a thin silver band with a small diamond that shimmered under the warm cafe lights. The stone wasn't large, but it was real, carefully set, the kind of ring someone might have saved money for. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly. The child standing before him looked completely calm, as if what she had just done was the most normal thing in the world. Around them, the late afternoon crowd inside Corner Bean Cafe continued its usual rhythm. He looked again at the ring. "You're serious," he said quietly. The girl nodded. "Yes." Ethan turned the ring between his fingers, watching the tiny diamond catch the light. "Where did you get this?" he asked gently. "It's my mom's." Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly. "And she knows you're giving it away to strangers?" The girl shook her head. "No, that seems like a fairly important detail." "She doesn't know yet," the girl replied. Her tone wasn't nervous. She pulled out the chair across from him. "Can I sit?" Ethan gestured politely. "Of course." She climbed onto the chair and placed both hands neatly on the table. "My name is Annie." "That's a good name," Ethan said. "I'm Ethan." She nodded once, as if filing that information away for later. Then she pointed toward the tall glass building across the street. "My mom works up there." Ethan followed her finger toward Lakeview Tower, the 14-story office building where hundreds of employees finished their workdays every evening. "What floor?" he asked. 14. That's very precise. She works at Midwest Insurance, Annie explained proudly. "Office administrator." Ethan nodded slowly. "So you decided to come downstairs and arrange your mother's marriage?" "Yes." Her answer came without hesitation. Ethan studied her carefully. "And why exactly do you think I'm the right person for this job?" Annie looked toward the window for a moment, thinking. Then she spoke softly. "My mom gets very quiet at night." Ethan didn't interrupt. "She thinks I'm asleep," Annie continued. "But sometimes I wake up, her small hands folded together, and I hear her crying." The words landed quietly but heavily. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "What does she cry about?" he asked gently. Annie glanced down at the ring in his hand. "My dad promised he would marry her." Ethan's fingers stilled. "He worked far away," Annie said. "Construction projects in different states." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He said when he came home, he would buy her a wedding dress. But when my mom got pregnant with me," Annie continued quietly, "he got sick." Ethan swallowed slightly. "He died before he could come back." The sentence was spoken simply. Children often carried grief with a clarity adults struggled to hold. "He never got to ask her to marry him," Annie said. Ethan looked down at the ring again. "This was supposed to be the engagement ring?" he asked. Annie nodded. "My mom keeps it in a little box." Her voice softened further. "Sometimes at night she puts it on her finger." Ethan felt the weight of the ring increase in his hand. "She stands in front of the mirror and whispers." "What does she whisper?" he asked quietly. Annie answered without hesitation. "She says maybe one day someone will finally ask." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. "My mom says she's fine," Annie added. "But I know she feels empty after work." She gestured toward the tall building across the street. "She helps people all day, solves their problems, answers their questions." Then Annie looked directly at him. "But when she comes home, there's nobody waiting for her." Ethan followed her gaze to his own coffee cup. "And you think marriage will fix that?" he asked gently. "Not everything." Annie leaned forward slightly. "But it would help." She pointed toward him. "You sit here every day." Ethan blinked. "I do." "Yes. Same table. Same coffee." He leaned back slightly. "You've been observing me?" "I wait here after school," Annie explained, "until Mom finishes work." Near the window sat a small table with crayons and a half-finished drawing. "That's your table?" Ethan asked. She nodded. "I draw." He studied her again. "And during all that drawing, you've been watching the lonely businessman drinking coffee." "Yes." She tilted her head slightly. "You look lonely." The honesty was disarming. "My mom is lonely too," Annie added softly. Then she smiled just a little. "So I thought maybe lonely people could help each other." Ethan couldn't help the quiet laugh that escaped him. "That's quite a strategy. I thought about it for a long time." "I can tell." She pointed gently at the ring in his hand. "If you marry my mom, her promise can finally come true." Ethan looked down again at the silver band, a promise that had never been fulfilled. a wedding that had never happened. You believe I'm the solution to this situation, he said. Yes. Based on what evidence? Annie smiled. You listened. That answer caught him completely off guard. Ethan Carter had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who talked. Very few people simply listened. But Annie had noticed. Well, Ethan said slowly, this is certainly the most unusual proposal I've ever received. Her eyes lit up. Does that mean you'll do it? Ethan smiled. I think it means I should think about it. Her grin spread instantly. That's fair. She slid off the chair. My mom finishes work in about 15 minutes. She pointed to the small table near the window. I'll be over there. Annie walked back to her crayons and resumed coloring as if proposing marriage to strangers was a perfectly ordinary part of the afternoon. Ethan remained seated. The ring rested quietly in his palm. Outside the window, lights began flickering on inside the offices of Lakeview Tower, 14 floors above the street. Somewhere up there, a woman was finishing another long workday, a woman who wore this ring alone at night, and whispered to herself about a wedding that had never happened. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter closed his laptop before finishing his work, and as he watched the office lights across the street, he found himself wondering about Annie's mother. Across the room, Annie sat at her little table near the window. She had returned to coloring with the calm focus of a child who believed her work for the afternoon was already finished. Crayons rolled softly across the table as she drew. Every few moments she glanced toward Ethan, just to make sure he was still there. Ethan was no longer thinking about emails or quarterly reports or the conference call he had canceled earlier. He was watching the elevator lights moving up and down the glass column of Lakeview Tower. 14 floors. Somewhere up there, Annie's mother was finishing another long workday. Ethan turned the ring slowly between his fingers again. A promise that had never been fulfilled. A wedding that had never happened. And somehow that promise had now landed in his hand. A barista approached his table carefully. She had been observing the entire exchange with quiet fascination. Another coffee, sir? She asked. Ethan looked up. Yes, thank you. She poured the coffee slowly. Then she nodded toward Annie's table. That little girl's here every afternoon. Ethan glanced over. She waits for her mom? Every day after school, the barista said. She's the easiest kid in the world. Colors, reads, never causes trouble. Ethan nodded. And her mom? Works upstairs, the barista said. Insurance office. He had already heard that from Annie. The barista hesitated, then added quietly, nice woman. Hard worker. Ethan lifted his cup. That seems to be the general consensus. The barista smiled faintly and returned to the counter. Outside, the sky over Chicago had turned a soft steel blue. Traffic lights flickered along Michigan Avenue, while the wind pushed cool air between the tall buildings. Ethan glanced toward Annie again. She had finished her drawing. Now she was carefully blowing crayon dust off the page like it was something important. He stood and walked over. Annie looked up immediately. Oh, good, she said. You didn't leave. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her small table. I said I'd think about it. She nodded approvingly. That's responsible. He looked down at the drawing. 3 figures stood side by side. A tall one, a medium one, and a very small one holding both their hands. That's your family? Ethan asked. Yes. She pointed to the tall figure. That's you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You're very confident in your plan. She shrugged. I have faith. He couldn't help smiling. Children believed in things adults stopped believing in a long time ago. Footsteps echoed near the cafe entrance as a new group of office workers entered, shaking off the cold air outside. Annie glanced at the door, then at the clock above the counter. She should be here soon, she said. Ethan followed her gaze toward Lakeview Tower again. His mind drifted unexpectedly. 4 years earlier, he had stood in a hospital hallway while a doctor spoke quietly about complications and things that couldn't be undone. His wife, Claire, had been the one who believed in weddings and anniversaries and traditions. Ethan had been the one who believed in work. When she died, the apartment overlooking Lake Michigan became too quiet. He returned his attention to Annie. Tell me something, he said. Okay, does your mother know you think she's lonely? Annie thought about that. I think she tries not to be. That sounds complicated. She nodded. She smiles a lot. Then Annie added quietly, but smiling isn't the same as being happy. Ethan looked down at the ring again. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with less emotional complexity than this moment. So your solution, he said, was to propose marriage on her behalf. Yes. You didn't consider starting with something smaller? Like what? Introducing us? Annie thought very seriously. Then she shook her head. That would take too long. Ethan laughed softly. For the first time in a very long time, the sound felt natural. Suddenly Annie sat up straight. Mom! Ethan turned toward the cafe door. A woman had just stepped inside. She looked tired. Not dramatically exhausted. Not the kind that demanded sympathy, just the quiet fatigue of someone who had worked a full day solving problems that were never truly theirs. Her brown hair was tied loosely behind her head. A gray office sweater hung over a simple blouse. She carried a worn leather purse and a folder tucked under her arm. When she saw Annie, her face changed instantly. Warmth replaced the tiredness. "There you are," she said softly. Annie jumped up from the chair and ran toward her. Ethan remained seated at the table. From a distance, he watched the woman kneel slightly to hug her daughter. "How was school?" she asked. "Good. Did you behave?" "Yes." The woman smiled. "That's what you always say." Then Annie grabbed her hand and turned excitedly toward Ethan's table. "Mom," she said proudly, "this is Ethan." The woman followed her daughter's gaze. For the first time, her eyes met Ethan Carter's. She didn't recognize him, not as a billionaire, not as the founder whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines. To her, he was simply a well-dressed man sitting in a coffee shop. Ethan stood politely. "Good evening." She nodded politely. "Hello." Annie tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, guess what?" "What?" I proposed. The woman blinked. "You, what?" Annie pointed directly at Ethan. "I asked him to marry you." The woman froze. For 2 seconds, the entire cafe seemed to fall silent again. Then she looked at Ethan, then at Annie, then at the ring in Ethan's hand. Her face turned bright red. "Oh my goodness," she said quickly. "I am so sorry." She looked mortified. She sometimes gets imaginative. Ethan felt a small smile forming. It was a very thoughtful proposal. "I promise I didn't know she was doing this." Annie tugged on her sleeve again. "Mom, it's okay." He said he'd think about it. Her mother closed her eyes briefly. Ethan noticed the exhaustion in her shoulders, the quiet strength too. And suddenly he understood why Annie had tried so hard. Loneliness recognized loneliness. He stepped forward slightly and held out the ring. "I believe this belongs to you." The woman looked at the ring in his hand. For a brief moment, something vulnerable passed across her face. Then she gently took it. "Yes," she said softly, "it does." If this moment touched your heart, please take a second to like this video. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because I truly love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about kindness, justice, and unexpected human connections, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Annie looked between them with bright expectation. Ethan glanced once more at the woman who wore that quiet tiredness like armor. And for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, he realized Annie's unusual proposal might not be as impossible as it first sounded. Laura Bennett did not sit down. She stood beside Annie with the silver ring curled tightly in her hand, as if holding it too loosely might let her embarrassment spill out into the entire cafe. "I really am sorry," she said again, this time more quietly. "She has a very active imagination." Annie looked up at her mother, offended. "It's not imagination if I mean it." Laura closed her eyes for half a second, the way tired mothers sometimes did when they were deciding which problem to solve first and which one to survive for later. Ethan should have let the moment end there. He should have smiled politely, wished them a good evening, and walked back into the life he understood, a life of elevator rides to private offices, black cars waiting at curbs, and apartments so quiet they echoed. Instead, he heard himself say, "Please, don't worry about it." Laura looked at him, still clearly mortified. "She's never done anything like this before." "That's disappointing," Ethan said mildly. "I was hoping I'd been specially selected." To his surprise, a laugh escaped her. It was small and tired, but real. Something in her face softened. Annie brightened immediately. "See? I told you he was nice." Laura gave her daughter a look that belonged to every overworked mother in America. "We are definitely discussing boundaries on the drive home." Annie seemed untroubled by that possibility. She climbed back into her chair and resumed guarding her crayons like a person who had successfully completed an important negotiation. Ethan glanced at the empty chair across from Annie's little table, then back at Laura. "You've had a long day," he said. Would you like to sit down for a minute? Laura hesitated. He could see the debate happening behind her eyes. Women like her had spent too many years measuring risk quickly and silently. Sit or don't sit. Trust or don't trust. Accept kindness or pay for it later. I don't want to intrude, she said. You wouldn't be. That made 2 chairs. Annie solved the problem by patting the seat beside her mother. Please sit, Mom. You look like your feet hurt. Laura gave a quiet sigh that said her daughter was correct, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise. She slid into the chair, set her purse carefully at her feet, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind one ear. Up close, Ethan noticed the details. A faint crease between her brows from years of concentration. The pale indentation on her ring finger where she must sometimes wear the silver band. Hands that looked soft at first glance but carried the small signs of hard work, dry knuckles, a paper cut near the thumb, the faint tension of someone always carrying too much. Thank you, she said, meaning the chair, the moment, perhaps more than that. You're welcome. A barista appeared beside them. The usual hot chocolate for Annie? She asked. Laura smiled faintly. Please. The barista looked at Laura. And for you? Just coffee. Ethan lifted a hand slightly. Put it on my tab. Laura turned to him at once. That's not necessary. It's coffee, he said. Not a controlling financial maneuver. Annie let out a delighted snort. Laura tried not to smile and failed. Well, she said. In that case, thank you. The drinks arrived a minute later. Annie cupped the mug of hot chocolate with both hands. Laura stared at her coffee as if it might personally apologize for the day she'd had. For a moment, none of them spoke. Outside, the traffic thickened. A city bus hissed to a stop. Office workers streamed out of Lakeview Tower, shoulders bent against the evening wind. The glass of the building reflected the darkening sky like a wall of cold fire. Laura finally looked at Ethan. I should probably explain. You don't have to. No, she said, glancing at Annie. I probably do. Annie lifted her cocoa and took a solemn sip. Laura let out a breath. She heard things she wasn't meant to hear. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the ring now resting beside Laura's coffee cup. She told me a little. Laura's fingers tightened around the mug. That ring belonged to Annie's father, she said. Or rather, it was meant to belong to me. Her voice didn't shake. The pain was old enough to be organized now. Old enough to be carried with dignity. That somehow made it sadder. He worked pipeline construction, she continued. Different states. Long contracts. We spent most of our relationship promising each other that the distance was temporary. Annie watched her mother closely, as if she'd heard this story before and still needed to know it ended in the same place. He used to call every night, Laura said. He always said the same thing. One more job, Laura. One more stretch away, and then I'll come home and do this right. Ethan listened quietly. He had the ring already, she said. He'd saved for it. Kept it in his duffel bag because he wanted to be holding it when he asked. She smiled then, but it was the kind of smile grief made out of memory. He got sick on a project in New Mexico. What they thought was the flu turned into something much worse. It moved fast. Annie looked down into her hot chocolate. I was pregnant by then, Laura said. He kept telling me he was coming back. Kept promising me we'd have our wedding, even if it was small. Even if it was just the 2 of us in some courthouse with bad lighting. She paused, then looked at the ring. He died before he got home. The sounds of the cafe returned in small fragments around them, the scrape of a chair, the low hiss of steam, somebody laughing too loudly near the counter. Ethan did not trust himself to speak right away. I'm sorry, he said at last, and heard how inadequate it sounded. Laura nodded anyway, the way people do when they know there are no better words. I didn't mean for Annie to carry any of that, she said. I thought I'd been careful. Annie frowned. I don't carry it. I just hear it. Laura's face changed. Not defensive, not angry, just broken open a little. Sweetheart, you cry very quietly, Annie said gently. But I can still hear you. Laura's eyes closed. The ache of that moment settled over the table with a tenderness Ethan hadn't expected to witness, let alone join. When Laura opened her eyes again, she looked at Ethan with the kind of honesty exhaustion sometimes produces. Most days I think I'm doing all right, she said. I get up. I go to work. I pack lunches. I help with spelling words. I pay bills. I do all the things people do when life keeps moving. She glanced at Annie. And then some nights it hits me that the life I thought I was walking toward never happened. There it was. Not drama, not self-pity, just truth. Ethan looked out at the darkening street for a moment. The life I thought I was walking toward never happened. He understood that sentence better than he wanted to. My wife died 4 years ago, he said quietly. Laura looked up. He rarely said it out loud to strangers. He rarely said it plainly at all. But something about this table, this child, this ring, asked for plain truth. It was sudden, he added. And after that, I got very good at staying busy. Laura studied him for a moment. Whatever she saw seemed to settle something in her. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded once. Annie looked between them and made the kind of silent calculation only children made, connecting sadness, loneliness, and possibility in one unbroken line. That's why I asked, she said softly. Laura turned. Annie, no, listen. Annie insisted. You're both lonely in the same way. Ethan should have found that impossible. Instead, he found it difficult to dismiss. Laura rubbed her forehead lightly. She's going to be impossible at 13. Probably, Ethan said. Annie smiled into her mug. The three of them sat there for another minute, held together by nothing more official than coffee, hot chocolate, and the memory of promises that life had interrupted. Then Laura checked the time and straightened. We should go. Annie made a disappointed sound, but she knew the rhythm of evenings. Homework, dinner, baths, bedtime. The ordinary sacred routine of two-person families. Laura slipped the ring back into her purse, then stood. Thank you, she said to Ethan. And this time it clearly meant more than the coffee. He stood too. For what? For not making her feel foolish. Ethan looked at Annie. She didn't. Annie smiled with the quiet triumph of the deeply vindicated. Laura shook her head slightly, almost smiling again. As she lifted her purse strap onto her shoulder, Annie tugged at her sleeve, then turned back to Ethan. We come here every day, she said, except Sundays. Laura looked horrified. Annie, what? Annie asked. I'm just giving him information. Ethan laughed softly. That's useful information. Laura opened her mouth to apologize again, but he spared her. Have a good night, he said. She held his gaze for one extra second, as if deciding whether she believed in him. Then she nodded. You too, Ethan. He watched them leave the cafe together. Annie talking with both hands the way excited children did. Laura listening with tired love and half a smile. At the door, Annie turned and waved. Ethan waved back before he could stop himself. Then they stepped out into the Chicago evening and disappeared into the river of people moving home. He sat down again after they were gone. His coffee had gone cold. His laptop remained closed. And for the first time in years, the quiet that met him did not feel empty. It felt expectant. The next afternoon, Ethan told himself he was only going back to Corner Bean because the coffee was decent and the cafe was quieter than his office. It was a lie, and he knew it before his driver even pulled away from the curb. He stood for a moment outside the glass door, watching the reflection of Lakeview Tower shimmer across the window. Office workers streamed in and out around him with paper cups in their hands, shoulders tight with the familiar fatigue of late afternoon. The city moved at its usual pace, restless, efficient, uninterested in private hopes or old griefs. Inside, the cafe was warm and smelled of espresso and cinnamon. Annie was already there. She sat at her usual table near the window, one sneaker hooked around the leg of the chair, a book open in front of her. Her rabbit backpack lay on the floor. A half-eaten oatmeal cookie sat on a napkin beside her. When she looked up and saw him, her whole face lit at once. You came back. Ethan felt something shift inside him at the certainty in her voice. I was told the coffee here is excellent. Annie narrowed her eyes with dramatic suspicion. That's not why. Before Ethan could answer, the barista behind the counter called out, Your usual? Mr. Carter? Annie turned sharply. Your usual? Ethan glanced at the barista, who immediately looked like she regretted speaking. Yes, he said calmly. Black coffee. Annie's eyes widened. So you do come here every day? Ethan walked to her table and set down his coat over the back of the empty chair. Apparently I've been caught. She pushed her book aside. You can sit. He sat. For a moment they looked at each other in comfortable silence, as though they had already established a sort of arrangement. Outside, buses hissed at the curb. Inside, The low music and soft clatter of cups gave the afternoon a steady rhythm. "What are you reading?" Ethan asked. Annie turned the book toward him. It was a library copy of Charlotte's Web, corners softened from use. "My teacher says it's a classic." "She's right. You've read it?" "When I was about your age." Annie looked impressed. "So you were once a child?" "Briefly." That made her laugh. The barista delivered Ethan's coffee and Annie's hot chocolate without asking. Ethan thanked her, then watched Annie wrap both hands around the mug, as if heat itself could be trusted more when held properly. "Did your mom know you were coming back?" he asked. "No. That seems to be a pattern." Annie gave him a look that suggested he was missing the larger strategy. "She doesn't need to know everything right away." Ethan lifted his cup, hiding a smile. "How's school?" "Fine." That single word carried the exact flatness of a child who had already decided the subject was unworthy of real discussion. "Just fine." Annie shrugged. "Math is boring. Reading is good. Recess depends." "Depends on what?" "People." There was something so adult in that answer that Ethan lowered his coffee. "What kind of people?" Annie stirred her cocoa with a small wooden stick. "The kind who think if you don't have a dad at pickup then they should say things." Ethan's expression changed before he could stop it. "What things?" Annie did not answer immediately. Instead, she kept stirring, watching the tiny whirlpool she made in the chocolate. "Just things," she said at last. Ethan had spent years in boardrooms hearing men say cruel things with polished voices and clean smiles. He knew evasion when he heard it. "Annie," she looked up. "Sometimes they ask if my mom forgot to get married," she said. "Sometimes they say weddings are supposed to happen before babies, not after." She said it in the same tone one might use to report the weather plain, practiced, already endured. Something hard flashed through Ethan's chest. "And what do you say?" Annie lifted one shoulder. "That they should mind their own business." He almost smiled. "That's not bad advice." "She says that too." For a moment they sat quietly. Then Annie added, "One boy said maybe no one wanted to marry her." The words sat between them like a stain. Ethan set down his cup. "And what did you say to that?" Annie's small chin lifted. "I said he was wrong." Something in him tightened and softened at the same time. "That seems correct." She nodded, satisfied. Then her expression changed. "But I didn't know how to prove it." The honesty of that landed more deeply than the insult itself. Children were always trying to prove something to the world with whatever little they had: good behavior, perfect spelling tests, brave smiles, impossible questions asked in cafes. And Annie, with her real ring and her unwavering certainty, had tried to prove that her mother was still chosen, still worthy of being chosen. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked toward the tower across the street. 14 floors up, people were finishing meetings, answering last emails, packing bags. Somewhere among them was Laura Bennett, moving through another day with quiet competence and the private ache of an unfinished promise. "How long have people been saying those things?" he asked. "Long enough." That answer belonged to someone much older than 6. He looked back at her. "Does your mother know?" "No." "Why not?" Annie frowned into her mug. "Because she already works too hard." Ethan did not answer immediately. He thought of Laura's face the night before, composed, tired, dignified. The expression of a woman who had trained herself to keep moving whether she was whole or not. He knew that expression. He wore a version of it himself. Annie looked at him carefully. "You know what I think? I'm beginning to suspect I'll hear it whether I ask or not." This made her smile. "I think grown-ups get lonely because they stop asking for things." Ethan stared at her. The low hum of the cafe blurred at the edges. Children, he thought, did not know enough about life to be cautious with truth. "And you," he said slowly, "have decided to ask on your mother's behalf." "Yes, even if it embarrasses her." "Yes, even if it confuses strangers." "That too." He gave a quiet laugh. Then Annie reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded page. "I made something." She slid it across the table. Ethan opened it carefully. It was another drawing. This one was more detailed than yesterday's 3 figures standing in front of a church with a peaked roof and stained glass windows done in crayon blue. The tallest figure wore a dark suit. The woman beside him had yellow flowers in her hand. Between them stood a small girl in a purple dress, smiling so widely it took up most of her face. At the top, in large uneven letters, Annie had written, "Someday." Ethan looked at the picture longer than he meant to. "Purple dress?" he asked quietly. "It's a wedding," Annie said. "There should be color." He nodded once. Yes, there should. She took another sip of hot chocolate. You can keep it. He folded the picture with unusual care. Thank you. Just then, the cafe door opened, and a gust of cold air slipped inside. Laura stepped through it with her purse on one shoulder and a folder tucked under her arm. She looked up automatically toward Annie's table, and stopped. Her eyes moved from Annie to Ethan. Surprise flashed first, then caution, then something else he could not quite name. Annie brightened immediately. Mom. He came back. Laura crossed the room more slowly this time. Clearly, she said, but her voice held none of yesterday's alarm, only weariness and a trace of resignation, as if she had spent all day suspecting this might happen. Ethan stood. Good evening, Mr. Carter. Ethan, he corrected gently. She hesitated, then nodded. Ethan. Annie looked between them, pleased by the progress of things no one had officially agreed to. Laura set down her folder and looked at her daughter. Have you been bothering him? No, Annie said. I've been updating him. Laura closed her eyes briefly. Ethan found himself smiling again. When she opened them, Laura looked at him with equal parts apology and reluctant amusement. I suppose I should thank you for surviving a second day. I'm doing better than surviving. That answer caught her off guard. For one brief moment, he saw it the woman she might have been before grief. Single motherhood and long office days taught her to carry herself so carefully. And when Annie tugged at her hand and said, Mom, sit down just for a minute, Laura did not refuse immediately. Laura set down her folder, looked at Annie, then at Ethan, and finally lowered herself into the empty chair with the careful surrender of someone too tired to keep arguing with the direction of the evening. 5 minutes, she said. Annie, who clearly considered this a major diplomatic victory, nodded, as if formal terms had been agreed upon. Ethan sat back down across from them. The barista appeared almost immediately, wearing the expression of a woman who knew a story was unfolding and intended to support it with caffeine. The usual? She asked Laura. Laura gave a faint smile. Please. And for the little negotiator? Hot chocolate, Annie said solemnly, with extra whipped cream, because diplomacy is hard. The barista laughed. Even Laura did. When the drinks arrived, the table settled into a strange and unexpected ease. Ethan had spent years dining in restaurants where everything was polished and expensive and forgettable. Yet this little cafe, with its scratched wooden tables and mismatched chairs, felt warmer than most places money could reserve. Laura wrapped both hands around her coffee but didn't drink right away. I should probably apologize again, she said. You've done that twice already. Yes. And I may do it a third time. Ethan glanced at Annie. I'm beginning to think she gets her persistence from you. Annie looked delighted by that possibility. Laura shook her head, but the corner of her mouth lifted. I had a meeting that ran late, she said. Usually by this time I'm just trying to get Annie home, fed, and into bed without forgetting something important. You forgot to be proposed to, Annie offered. Laura closed her eyes for half a second. Yes. Apparently I did. Ethan laughed under his breath. For a brief moment, Laura looked at him directly. Not cautiously this time. Not like he was a stranger she had to assess from a distance. Just directly. He realized then how pretty she was, though not in the obvious, manicured way the women in his world often were. There was no performance to her. No practiced charm. Her beauty lived in small things, in the intelligence of her eyes, the quiet control in her posture, the way fatigue hadn't erased her dignity. Annie took a dramatic sip of hot chocolate and announced, I told him about the drawing. Laura's head turned slowly. What drawing? The wedding one. Annie. What? Annie asked, genuinely confused by the objection. It was a good drawing. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully unfolded the page Annie had given him earlier. He set it on the table. Laura looked down at it. For a long moment she didn't speak. The church, the flowers, the 3 figures standing hand in hand beneath the uneven crayon letters. Someday, something in Laura's face softened and hurt at the same time. She's been drawing weddings for a year, she said quietly. Annie, sensing that her mother's tone had changed, went back to stirring her cocoa. Laura touched the corner of the page with one finger. Sometimes she leaves them under my bedroom door. Ethan watched the way she said it without embarrassment now, only honesty. She hears more than I think she does, Laura added. She loves you, Ethan said. Laura looked up at him. Yes, she said. She does. The simplicity of that answer carried the weight of everything else. The long days, the missed dinners, the quiet crying Annie had confessed to hearing through the walls, the stubborn determination to remain a good mother even while carrying grief that had never been properly buried. Ethan looked toward Annie, who was now carefully building a whipped cream mountain with the patience of an engineer. "And she's observant," he said. Laura let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. That too. Outside the cafe windows, the evening had darkened. Headlights stretched across the wet Chicago streets in long, pale ribbons. Workers hurried toward trains, buses, and waiting cars. The city moved with the brisk purpose of people trying to outrun the day. Inside, something slower had begun to settle at their table. Laura finally sipped her coffee. Then she said, "So what exactly did Annie tell you yesterday?" Annie brightened instantly. "Everything important." Laura turned to Ethan. "That's what I was afraid of." He considered the question. "She told me your husband. He wasn't my husband." Ethan stopped. Laura's expression changed slightly, though not with anger, more like precision. "He was supposed to be," she said. "But he wasn't." Ethan nodded. "She told me he worked far away, that he planned to come back and propose, that he got sick." Laura's gaze fell to her coffee. "That's about right." The cafe noise faded a little around them, or perhaps Ethan simply stopped hearing it. "He was 29, Laura said, which, at the time, felt grown up. Annie looked up. "That's old." Laura almost smiled. "Not to me anymore." She rested one forearm on the table and looked out at the street. "He took jobs wherever they paid well. West Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico. It was always temporary. Always one last stretch of bad motels and long phone calls, and promises about what life would look like when he came home for good." Her voice remained steady, but Ethan could hear the old ache beneath it. "He bought the ring 6 months before he died," she continued. "He called me and told me not to look in the little cedar box in my dresser because there was a surprise in it." Annie listened with complete stillness. "I looked," Laura said. That got a grin out of Annie. "Mom." "I know," Laura said. "Terrible character flaw." Ethan found himself smiling too. "I put it back exactly where it was," Laura said. "And when he called that night, I pretended I hadn't seen anything." "Why?" She looked at Ethan. "Because he sounded so happy." For a moment, silence held the table again. Then Laura said, "By the time I found out I was pregnant, he was already sick enough that he was trying to sound stronger than he was. He kept telling me he'd be home before the baby came. Kept saying we'd still have our wedding." Annie dropped her gaze into her mug. "We never talked about anything fancy," Laura said. "No ballroom, no orchestra, nothing like that. He used to joke that he'd marry me in a gas station parking lot if he had to." The sadness in her smile was almost unbearable in its restraint. "But he didn't make it home," Ethan said softly. Laura shook her head. "No." The words settled there between them. Ethan thought of Claire, then her scarf on the back of a dining chair for 3 weeks after the funeral because he had not been able to move it. The sound of her laugh in the apartment hall. The terrifying way a person could still exist everywhere after they were gone. He understood the discipline grief required. The strange neatness of it. The way it asked you to wake up, get dressed, answer emails, pack lunches, and pretend the world hadn't split down the middle. "I'm sorry," he said. Laura nodded once. "Thank you." Annie looked from one adult to the other. Then, with the merciless clarity unique to children, she asked Ethan, "Did your person die too?" Laura inhaled quickly. "Annie, it's all right," Ethan said. He had no idea why he said it. He almost never spoke of Claire to strangers. In his world, grief was either exploited or politely avoided. But there was nothing exploitative here. Only a little girl trying to understand why lonely people recognized each other. "Yes," he said. Annie's expression softened immediately. "That's why you sit by yourself." "Yes, and that's why you look sad sometimes." Laura looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her face changed. The guardedness loosened, not gone, but loosened. "My wife died 4 years ago," Ethan said quietly. "Car accident." Laura lowered her eyes for a second. "I'm sorry." He nodded. For a while, none of them spoke. Then Annie said, as if concluding a case with undeniable evidence, "See, I was right." Laura put down her cup. "About what?" "Lonely people should help each other." Laura opened her mouth, perhaps to correct her, perhaps to protect both of them from the simplicity of that statement. But nothing came out, because there was something undeniable in it. Not romance, not yet, just recognition. Just three people sitting at a table in a downtown cafe, carrying different versions of the same silence. Ethan looked at Laura. You mentioned yesterday that some nights it hits you, he said. That the life you thought you were walking toward never happened. She blinked, surprised he remembered her exact words. Yes, he nodded once. I know that feeling. Her gaze held his for a long second. Then Annie, apparently satisfied that the adults were finally catching up, reached for her backpack. Good, she said. Then maybe we can all stop wasting time. Laura let out a helpless laugh. Ethan laughed too, and for the first time in a very long time, the sound did not feel borrowed from some older version of himself. It felt present, earned. Outside, a black SUV eased to the curb across the street, waiting for Ethan the way it always did at the end of the day. Laura noticed it through the window. That's for you? She asked. Ethan followed her gaze. Yes. She studied him for a moment. The tailored coat, the watch, the polished shoes. Perhaps she was beginning to place him somewhere beyond man who drinks coffee nearby. Perhaps not yet. Either way, Annie looked out too and said, That is a very fancy car. Ethan smiled faintly. It's just a car. Annie turned back with the solemn disbelief of a child who knew perfectly well when something was not just anything. Laura checked the time and straightened. We really do need to go. This time, Ethan stood when she did. Annie slipped on her backpack, clutching her half-finished drawing book and the remains of her cookie wrapped in a napkin for later. Laura gathered her purse and folder. Then she looked at Ethan. Not embarrassed now, not apologizing. Thank you, she said, for being kind. The word landed in him with unexpected force. He had been called many things in his life. Important, brilliant, ruthless, strategic. Kind was rarer. You're welcome, he said. Annie stepped forward before her mother could stop her and lowered her voice confidentially. We'll be back tomorrow. Laura looked skyward as if appealing to a patient god. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Laura. Good night, Annie said brightly. Future possibility. Laura nearly dropped her folder. Ethan laughed, and as they disappeared into the evening crowd beyond the cafe door, he realized he was already wondering whether Annie would be right about tomorrow too. The next day, Ethan told himself he had no business rearranging his schedule around a child with impossible plans and a woman he had met twice. Then he moved a board call, ignored 2 messages from his chief of staff, and walked into Corner Bean Cafe at 4:28. The barista looked up, took one glance at him, and smiled with the private satisfaction of someone watching a theory become fact. Right on time, she said. Ethan gave her a look. I'm here for the coffee. Of course you are. She handed him his usual black coffee before he even reached the register. The cafe carried its familiar late afternoon warmth. Steam rose from cups, coat sleeves brushed past chairs. The city's white-collar fatigue pressed in from the sidewalks, then softened the moment people stepped into the smell of espresso and baked bread. Annie was not at her table. For reasons he did not care to examine too closely, Ethan felt the absence immediately. He glanced toward the window. No rabbit backpack, no crayons, no open book. You look disappointed, the barista said. I look observant. She nodded toward the far end of the cafe. They're late today. Ethan followed her gaze, then took his coffee to his usual table by the window. Lakeview Tower stood across the street like a wall of glass and steel, reflecting the gray afternoon sky. Somewhere on the 14th floor, Laura Bennett was still at work. He found himself looking for her among the lit windows, which was ridiculous for several reasons. Chief among them the fact that he had no idea what her office faced. He sat down, opened his laptop, and stared at a screen full of numbers that could not hold his attention for more than 20 seconds at a time. He told himself this was temporary. At 4:39, the cafe door opened. Cold air swept in first. Then, Annie, half running, half skipping, came through with her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. Laura followed behind her, coat unbuttoned, hair slightly windswept, one hand still gripping her phone as if she had ended a work call seconds before stepping inside. Annie spotted him instantly. He's here. Several customers glanced over. Laura stopped walking. For one brief second, Ethan saw surprise pass through her face, followed quickly by something gentler. Not quite pleasure, not yet, but something adjacent to it. "Well," she said as they approached, "I suppose I shouldn't be shocked." Ethan stood. "I was told the coffee was worth returning for." Annie put both hands on her hips. "You used that excuse already." Laura gave a tired laugh, and somehow that small sound changed the room around him. "You remember," Ethan said. "It was a weak excuse the first time," she replied, slipping off her coat. It didn't improve overnight. The barista arrived with the timing of a woman deeply invested in the development of strangers' lives. "Usuals?" she asked. Laura nodded. "Please," Annie lifted a finger. "And a brownie, because I had a hard day." Laura turned. "A hard day does not automatically qualify as a brownie day." "It should," Annie said with conviction. The barista looked at Laura. "Honestly, I'm with her." Laura gave in with the expression of a mother who knew she had already lost the vote. "One brownie. Thank you," Annie said to all involved, then slid into her chair as though presiding over a committee. Ethan sat across from them. Laura placed her purse on the floor and rubbed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. The movement was small, but it carried the full weight of office lights, emails, interruptions, and the invisible labor of being competent all day long. "Rough afternoon?" Ethan asked. Laura exhaled. "One of our regional managers decided at 3:45 that an issue he'd ignored for 2 weeks was suddenly an emergency." "That sounds familiar." She gave him a look. "Corporate?" He nodded. "Very." Annie leaned in. "Mom says when men in offices wait too long, they call it urgent and expect women to fix it." Laura closed her eyes briefly. "I said that at home." Annie shrugged. It was true there too. Ethan took a sip of coffee to hide his smile. The drinks arrived. Annie's brownie came on a small white plate, which she received with the reverence some people reserved for religion. Laura wrapped both hands around her coffee again, and Ethan wondered if the warmth mattered more to her than the caffeine. Annie cut into the brownie with dramatic seriousness, then paused. "I forgot," she said. "What?" Laura asked. "I need to show him." "Show me what?" Annie opened her backpack and began digging with the frantic efficiency unique to children who knew exactly where something was in theory and nowhere in practice. Finally, she pulled out a construction paper project, slightly bent at one corner. "It's for school," she said, handing it to Ethan. He looked down. The title, written in large, uneven letters, read, "My Family History." Below it, Annie had glued photographs, drawn hearts, and written short sentences in pencil. One photo showed Laura younger, visibly pregnant, smiling beside a man in a baseball cap with an easy, sunburned face. Another was of newborn Annie wrapped in a hospital blanket. There was a copied image of a silver ring taped crookedly near the center, and below it, in careful first-grade handwriting, "My dad was going to marry my mom. He got sick and died before the wedding. My mom still kept the ring. I think love should finish things." Ethan read the last line twice. Laura leaned over and saw where his eyes had stopped. A quiet stillness entered her face. "She wrote that part herself," she said. Annie nodded proudly. "My teacher said it was poetic." "It is," Ethan said. Annie brightened. Laura looked at the page for a moment longer, then sat back. "I didn't know she'd put the ring in there. I asked if I could," Annie said. "And I said yes? You were making spaghetti when I asked." Laura considered that. "That does sound like something I might agree to while distracted." Ethan kept looking at the sentence. "I think love should finish things." Something about it lodged under his ribs. In his world, love often ended in the middle of things. Mid-conversation, mid-plan, mid-life. One phone call, and everything split apart into before and after. The idea that love ought to finish what it started felt almost radical. "It's a good line," he said quietly. Laura looked at him. "She gets that from her father." Annie shook her head. "No, I get it from both of you." Laura frowned. "Both of who?" Annie looked up from her brownie with complete innocence. "You and Ethan." Laura nearly choked on her coffee. "Absolutely not," she said. Ethan set down the family history page very carefully and tried not to laugh. Annie looked confused by the resistance. "You're both sad in a committed way." For one full second, none of the adults at the table could speak. Then Ethan laughed. He could not help it. A real laugh. Brief, but unguarded. Even Laura, who clearly wanted to object on principle, covered her mouth as a smile broke through. A committed way? Ethan repeated. Yes, Annie said. Not a dramatic way, just a tired, quiet way. Laura shook her head in surrender. I'm going to need her teacher to stop encouraging descriptive writing. But the smile remained on her face. Outside, the lights in the tower across the street came on floor by floor as daylight thinned into evening. The city looked colder now, harder edged, all reflective glass and moving headlights. Inside the cafe, their little table had begun to feel strangely insulated from that hardness. Ethan handed the project back to Annie. This is very well done. Thank you. Did you tell your class about it? Annie nodded. And? She took another bite of brownie. Some kids asked weird questions. Laura's eyes sharpened. What kind of weird questions? Annie shrugged, though not casually enough to hide that it mattered. They wanted to know why you kept the ring if there wasn't a wedding. Laura stared at her for a moment. Why didn't you tell me that? Because you had that big report due. Ethan felt anger flicker quietly inside him, not loud, not impulsive, but precise. He had seen adults wound each other with subtler cruelty than that and call it curiosity. What did you say? He asked Annie. She swallowed carefully. I said because promises still matter even if they hurt. Laura looked down. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she reached across the table and touched Annie's hand. The gesture was so small, so ordinary, that Ethan might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so closely. No one should be making you explain grown-up pain, Laura said softly. Annie leaned into the touch. It's okay. No, Laura said. And now her voice carried that firm maternal tone that came from love more than anger. It's not. Ethan watched her then, and understood something important. Laura Bennett was tired, yes. Grieving, yes. Lonely in a way that made his chest tighten when he recognized it. But she was also strong. Not in the loud, polished way people admired at conferences and in headlines. In the way that held households together. In the way that made lunches appear, homework get checked, tears get dried, and dignity survive another impossible day. And Annie knew it. That was why the child had walked across a cafe with a ring. Not because she lived in fantasy. Because she had seen her mother carry too much for too long. Annie finished the last bite of brownie and looked at Ethan as if returning to the matter at hand. So, she said, have you thought about it more? Laura closed her eyes. Annie. What? He said he would think about it. Ethan met the little girl's gaze, then looked at Laura, whose face had gone pink again from equal parts embarrassment and exhaustion. And for the first time, he did not answer with a joke. Yes, he said. I have. Laura looked up at him. The air at the table shifted. Annie went completely still. Ethan did not yet know what he meant to do with the answer growing quietly inside him. But he knew one thing with unusual certainty. He was no longer coming back to the cafe for the coffee. Yes, he said, I have. The words seemed to settle over the table with far more weight than Ethan had intended. Annie's eyes widened first. Laura's did not widen at all. They narrowed, not in anger, not quite, more in caution. The kind that came from being a woman who had learned that certain sentences could change the shape of a life if you were foolish enough to trust them too quickly. Ethan saw the shift immediately and, for perhaps the first time in years, felt a trace of nervousness. I don't mean, he said carefully, that I've reached a formal conclusion on a proposal made under highly unconventional circumstances. Annie slumped a little. Laura, despite herself, smiled into her coffee. Thank goodness, she murmured. But, Ethan continued, and now he looked at Laura rather than Annie. I have thought more about what she said. That wiped the smile from Laura's face, not because she disliked hearing it, but because she understood that he meant it. For a moment the noise of the cafe seemed to drift outward. The chatter at the counter, the clink of ceramic mugs, the low music humming from hidden speakers, everything softened around their table as if giving the conversation its own small circle of privacy. Annie, sensing something important was happening in adult language, held very still. Laura set down her coffee cup. What exactly did you think about? She asked. Ethan considered lying, not with words, perhaps, but with something easier. Politeness. Deflection. The casual charm successful men learned when they wanted to keep things pleasant without risking honesty. But honesty felt demanded here, not because Annie had pushed them toward some childish fairy tale, because grief had a way of making pretense feel insulting. I thought about what it means, he said, for a child to notice that her mother is lonely. Laura's fingers tightened slightly around the paper napkin beside her cup. I try very hard not to let that become her burden. I know. She's 6. I know. Laura glanced at Annie, then back at Ethan. And yet here we are. Annie raised a hand. In fairness, I brought us here. That earned a quick, helpless laugh from Laura and a quiet smile from Ethan. Children, he thought, could puncture tension with the precision of surgeons. Laura exhaled slowly. I don't like that she's worrying about grown-up things. She's not worrying, Ethan said softly. She's loving you. That landed harder than anything else had. Laura looked away first. Out the window, evening had deepened across Chicago. Headlights moved in thin, glowing lines. Office windows lit up one by one, squares of yellow against the blue-gray sky. Pedestrians hunched into coats and scarves as the wind came off the lake. Inside, Annie had resumed absent-mindedly dragging her fingertip through a streak of whipped cream left on her plate, though Ethan could tell she was listening to every word. Laura spoke without looking up. Love and worry are not always that different when you're 6. Ethan could not argue with that. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the woman across from him. There was nothing fragile about Laura Bennett. The world had clearly tried to wear her down for years, and she had responded by becoming efficient, composed, responsible. The kind of woman who remembered library due dates, utility bills, permission slips, and which cereal was on sale. The kind who would still apologize for being tired, as if fatigue were a flaw instead of a consequence. He had known women in his world who were polished within an inch of perfection. Laura was not polished. She was real, and that made her far more difficult to dismiss. I also thought, he said, about what Annie told me on the first day. Laura looked up again. About the ring? Yes. Her expression closed a little. That was a private thing. I understand. I'm not sure you do. Ethan let that sit. He was not used to being corrected. Not because people agreed with him, but because they usually avoided the risk of directness. Laura did not seem overly interested in avoiding risk when it came to truth. That ring, she said, her voice low and even, isn't some romantic symbol I keep around because I can't move on. It belongs to a life that ended before it had the chance to become what it was supposed to be. Annie looked down now. Laura softened instantly. Sweetheart, I'm not upset. I know. Laura turned back to Ethan. It reminds me that promises can be real even when life refuses to honor them. He nodded once. That makes sense. She studied him as if deciding whether he truly meant that. Most people, he realized, probably tried to console her when she spoke that way. You'll find love again. Everything happens for a reason. At least you have Annie. The sort of phrases people offered when they could not bear the shape of another person's pain. But Laura did not need consolation from him. She needed honesty, or nothing. My wife and I were supposed to have children, Ethan said. The sentence slipped out before he had fully planned it. Laura's expression changed. Not pity. Never that. Recognition. We never got that far, he continued. There was always another quarter, another launch, another trip I couldn't cancel. Claire used to say I treated life like something that could be rescheduled. He gave a short breath that was not quite a laugh. She was right. Laura said nothing, but her eyes held his. When she died, he said quietly, I kept thinking there would be some moment when the world would acknowledge the scale of what had happened. But the next morning, the market still opened. My inbox was still full. People still needed things from me. Annie looked between them very seriously. Grown-ups keep going even when they're sad, she said. Yes, Ethan replied. Sometimes that's the problem. Laura lowered her gaze. Yes, she said softly. Sometimes it is. The barista passed nearby, noticed the mood at the table, and wisely continued without interrupting. In the background, a group of young consultants laughed too loudly over something on a phone screen. An elderly man by the window folded his newspaper, finished his coffee, and left. Life moved. It always did. Annie pushed her empty plate aside and looked at Ethan. So when you thought about it more, she said carefully, you weren't thinking that Mom should marry you right away. Laura nearly inhaled her own breath in relief. Thank you, she muttered. Ethan smiled. No, not right away. Annie nodded, accepting this as a reasonable procedural delay. But maybe, she said, you were thinking maybe you should know her first. Laura turned slowly to look at him. He met her eyes. Yes, he said. There it was. Not a declaration. Not a flirtation polished into smooth charm. Just a simple truth, spoken plainly enough that it became almost impossible to hide from. Laura did not speak immediately. He could almost see her mind at work, measuring, questioning, protecting. Not only herself. Annie, too. A mother did not simply step aside and let possibility walk in because it happened to wear a good coat and speak gently over coffee. Finally, she said, "That would be complicated." Ethan nodded. "Probably. You don't know anything about me. I know some things." "Like what?" He answered without hesitation. "I know your daughter adores you. I know you work hard enough that she notices the cost. I know you've spent years carrying grief without making it theatrical. I know you still keep a ring because you believe unfinished promises deserve respect." Laura stared at him. The color in her face had changed. Not embarrassment now. Something warmer. Something more dangerous. Annie, realizing the adults were having one of those very important conversations where children were simultaneously central and expected to sit quietly, folded her hands in her lap and waited with visible effort. Laura looked down at the coffee sleeve around her cup, then back at Ethan. And what would knowing me look like? Exactly. That question mattered, not because the answer was difficult, but because he had not allowed himself to want one in a very long time. Ethan glanced around the cafe. "It might start," he said, "with coffee that has nothing to do with mergers, quarterly reports, or 6-year-old-led negotiations." Laura's mouth twitched. "That does sound unusually peaceful. I've heard peace is underrated." She let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "It is." Annie's eyes moved from one to the other with mounting satisfaction. "You could have coffee while I'm doing homework," she offered. Laura closed her eyes. "Annie, what?" "That solves childcare." Ethan laughed softly. Laura opened her eyes again, but the sternness did not fully return. "I appreciate the logistical support," she told her daughter. "You're welcome." Then Laura looked at Ethan with a seriousness that made everything around them feel briefly sharpened. "I'm not interested in being rescued," she said. "I know. I'm not impressed by money. I assumed as much. And if this," she gestured lightly between them, "is something you find amusing for a week because my daughter said something outrageous in a coffee shop, then I need you to be honest about that now." The directness of it struck him cleanly. This was who she was, he thought. Not cold, not defensive for sport, just unwilling to let herself become a passing curiosity in someone else's life. Ethan answered with equal directness. "I haven't been amused for a second." Laura held his gaze, and for the first time since he had met her, she seemed to believe him without reserve. Outside, wind pushed a swirl of leaves down the sidewalk. The city darkened. Lakeview Tower glowed behind the window like a grid of human fatigue. Inside, Annie leaned forward with shining eyes. "So," she whispered, as if afraid the moment might break if spoken too loudly. "Is this progress?" Laura looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Laura. Then, despite herself, Laura smiled. "Yes," she said. Annie sat back in triumph. Ethan, who had spent most of his life closing deals with signatures and strategy, realized with some humility that the most important progress of the week had been won by a 6-year-old with courage and very little patience. Progress, Ethan would later realize, had a way of becoming real the moment it stopped sounding theoretical. By the time they left Corner Bean that night, Annie had decided 3 things with total certainty. First, Ethan was no longer merely a future possibility. Second, her mother's smile had lasted longer than usual. Third, this meant the universe was finally starting to cooperate. Laura, on the other hand, walked out of the cafe with her purse over one shoulder, Annie's backpack in one hand, and the uneasy awareness that something had shifted in a way she had not authorized. The Chicago evening was sharp with wind. Headlights streaked across the wet streets, and the glass of Lakeview Tower reflected the city back in fragments of silver and gold. Annie skipped a half-step ahead, humming to herself, while Laura kept one eye on traffic and the other on her daughter. Behind them, Ethan pushed through the cafe door just in time to hear Annie say, "I think tonight counts as a very successful day." Laura sighed. For who? Exactly. For everybody. Ethan slowed rather than catch up too quickly. He had spent years understanding pace, when to push, when to wait, when silence did more work than words. Laura Bennett was not a woman one hurried. Annie turned and spotted him immediately. "You're walking this way too?" Ethan glanced toward the curb where his black SUV waited under the street lamp. For at least a few more steps, Laura followed Annie's gaze to the SUV, then back to Ethan. Under the streetlights, the details were harder to ignore now: the cut of his coat, the discreet cost of his shoes, the quiet ease of a man accustomed to important spaces opening when he approached them. She had noticed those things before, of course. She was not blind. But now they seemed to gather into a question she had not yet asked. Annie solved the problem by asking none of the correct questions. Do billionaires always have cars like that? Laura stopped walking so abruptly, Ethan almost laughed. Annie, what? The child asked. I'm just checking. Ethan looked at Laura, then back at Annie. Who told you I'm a billionaire? The internet. Laura closed her eyes. Of course, the internet. Ethan should have been more surprised. Instead, he found himself oddly impressed. Annie was 6, and she had apparently advanced from matchmaking to background research. You looked him up? Laura asked. No, Annie said. Miss Rosa at the cafe did. Laura turned slowly toward Ethan. He offered the smallest possible shrug. That sounds consistent with her level of curiosity. Laura exhaled a short laugh despite herself. But the color had changed in her face. Not fear, not awe, wariness. There it was. The complication they had both known was coming. Annie, mercifully unaware of how adults' lives could tighten around new information, looked up at Ethan. So it's true? Yes. You have that much money? Yes. Why? That one genuinely made him laugh. It accumulated. Annie seemed to consider that answer flawed but acceptable. Laura resumed walking, more slowly now. Ethan fell into step beside them, careful to leave space. You could have mentioned that, Laura said after a moment. I could have. You didn't. No. She looked straight ahead as they approached the corner. Why not? Because money changed the temperature of every room, he thought. Because it made people perform. Because it made sincerity expensive. But what he said was simpler. Because your daughter had already asked me the most unusual question of my life. Bringing up my net worth felt secondary. That almost got a smile out of her. Almost. At the crosswalk, Annie took Laura's hand. Ethan stood beside them as the signal changed. Cars rolled past in long, glistening lines. Laura kept her eyes on the street when she spoke again. I don't know what to do with that information. You don't have to do anything with it. That's not true. The honesty in her voice stopped him. When a man has that kind of money, she said, it always becomes part of the conversation, even if nobody wants it to. He knew she was right. It shaped rooms. It altered assumptions. It invited judgment from strangers and suspicion from friends. The walk signal flashed white. They crossed. Annie squeezed between them, swinging her mother's hand with one arm and her backpack with the other. She looked absurdly happy for a child who should have been worrying about spelling homework instead of the emotional architecture of adults. At the opposite curb, Laura slowed. Her car was parked half a block down, an aging blue Honda with a dent near the rear light and a missing hubcap on one wheel. Ethan noticed, because he noticed everything. He also noticed the way Laura's jaw set slightly when she realized he had seen it. He understood that too. Pride was often just dignity wearing work clothes. You don't need to look concerned, she said, reading his face before he could fully control it. It runs. I wasn't concerned. You were absolutely concerned. I was assessing. That's a billionaire word for concerned. Annie burst out laughing. Ethan smiled. Maybe she was right. They reached the Honda. Laura unlocked the doors with a key fob that only worked on the second try. Annie climbed into the back seat and immediately began narrating the evening to a stuffed rabbit that appeared from somewhere inside the backpack. Laura set her purse on the front seat but didn't get in yet. She turned to Ethan. The streetlight caught the tiredness under her eyes, but it also caught something else now. Calculation, yes. A mother's caution, yes. But beneath it, curiosity, a living thing. I should probably say this plainly, she said. That would be in character. She gave him a look. I'm not impressed by wealth. I know. I'm impressed by consistency. That landed deeper than she intended. He could tell because she looked away for half a second after saying it. And if Annie gets attached to you, she continued, lowering her voice, I need to know you understand what that means. He did, more than she knew, because attachment was never abstract once a child was involved. It became routine, expectation, trust. A person showing up once was kindness. Showing up twice was pattern. 3 times was the beginning of hope. "I understand," he said quietly. Laura studied him for a long moment. Most women in his world either challenged him for sport or agreed with him for advantage. Laura did neither. She measured, tested, held the line until she believed what stood before her. Annie leaned forward from the back seat and knocked lightly on the window. Laura glanced back. "What? Are you saying goodbye forever, or regular goodbye?" Ethan laughed under his breath. Laura pressed her lips together, trying not to. "Regular goodbye," she called back. Annie seemed satisfied and returned to briefing the stuffed rabbit. Laura looked back at Ethan. "I don't know what this is," she said. "Neither do I." "That's not very reassuring." "It's honest." That, finally, earned him the smile. Small, brief, but real enough to change her whole face. He felt it like a physical thing. The city roared around them, buses groaning at stops, taxis sliding through wet intersections, a siren somewhere far south. Yet for a moment, everything felt strangely quiet. "I should get her home," Laura said. "Of course." She opened the driver's door, then paused. "Annie does homework at the cafe tomorrow," she said, not quite looking at him. "Thursdays are late for me. End of week processing." Ethan kept his voice steady. "That sounds exhausting." "It is." She nodded once, then added, "If you happen to want coffee tomorrow, I suppose the city won't stop you." There it was. Not an invitation dressed up as romance. Something better. Permission. He held her gaze. "Then I suppose I may have coffee tomorrow." Laura got into the car before the moment could become larger than either of them had prepared for. Annie popped back into view at the rear window and waved wildly. "Don't forget," she shouted through the glass. "Forget what?" Ethan called. "That lonely people should help each other." Laura dropped her forehead briefly against the steering wheel. Ethan laughed. Then the Honda pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, its taillights disappearing among the red ribbons of evening cars. He stood there for another moment, hands in his coat pockets, watching until the last trace of blue vanished from sight. His driver stepped out of the SUV and opened the rear door. "Home, Mr. Carter?" Ethan looked once more at the lighted windows of Lakeview Tower, then at the street where Laura's car had disappeared. "Yes," he said. But when he settled into the leather seat and the door closed behind him, the word felt different than it used to. Because for the first time in years, home no longer sounded like the end of the day. It sounded like the beginning of a question. The penthouse was exactly as Ethan left it every night. Silent, orderly, impeccably arranged by people he paid well enough to anticipate his needs without ever leaving traces of themselves behind. The lights rose automatically when he stepped inside. Warm recessed lighting slid across hardwood floors, polished stone counters, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, and the glittering geometry of Chicago after dark. The city spread below him in silver and gold, restless and alive. He set his keys in the same tray near the door, hung his coat in the same closet, walked past the same sculpture in the entryway that an art consultant had once insisted would make the apartment feel less austere. It had never worked. Tonight, though, the silence did not feel as empty as usual. It felt interrupted. He loosened his tie and moved toward the kitchen, where a covered plate waited in the refrigerator beside bottled water, and a note from Marisol, the housekeeper, reminding him that his sister had called twice and his breakfast meeting had been pushed to 8:30. Normally he would have eaten standing up. Normally he would have reviewed 3 presentations while answering late emails and trying not to look too long at the part of the dining table where Claire used to leave her books. Instead, he poured a glass of water and stood at the window. Below, headlights streamed along Lakeshore Drive, a ferry of red taillights, white ribbons of oncoming traffic. The city kept moving whether anyone's heart was ready for it or not. He thought of Laura's car. Old. Dent near the rear light. Missing hubcap. Engine probably making a sound mechanics could name, and mothers ignored for 3 more months because rent, groceries, and winter boots mattered more. He thought of Annie's small voice through the glass. Lonely people should help each other. It would have been easier if he could dismiss it as childish sentiment. But children did not invent loneliness. They only recognized it sooner than adults wanted them to. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Ben. Ethan stared at the name for a moment before answering. His younger brother never called without a reason, and almost never called at night unless the reason involved either family or trouble. Since the Carters had long ago developed the habit of converting most family matters into polished distance, Ethan assumed trouble. Ben, well, you sound cheerful. You called me at 9:13, which in brother time is practically afternoon. Ethan rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. What happened? Ben laughed softly. Nothing happened. I was in the neighborhood after dinner with clients, so I thought I'd call and see whether the great Ethan Carter was still alive or had finally merged with a quarterly earnings report. Ethan looked out at the city. Still alive. Good. I'd hate to explain to Mother that the family's best-known son was found in a conference room surrounded by charts. There was a pause. Then Ben's voice shifted into something less teasing. You all right? Ethan almost gave the automatic answer. Fine. Busy. Long day. The tidy phrases of men trained to remain untroubled. Instead, he said, I met someone. The silence on the other end was so immediate and complete it almost made him smile. Then Ben said, with deep suspicion, What do you mean? You met someone? I met someone. Voluntarily? Yes. In person? Yes, Ben. Has the building been checked for gas leaks? Ethan laughed despite himself. It's not like that. Ben made a sound that communicated the exact opposite of belief. So who is she? Ethan hesitated. That should have been answer enough. He had not spoken about a woman in any serious tone since Claire died. There had been dinners, introductions arranged by well-meaning friends, women who were lovely, accomplished, and entirely wrong for reasons he could never explain without sounding cruel. None of them had followed him home in thought. None of them had made the penthouse feel newly strange. She has a daughter, he said at last. Ben was quiet for a beat. That sounds real. Yes. Does she know who you are? Ethan leaned one shoulder against the glass. She does now. And I'm not sure that helped. Ben let out a knowing hum. No. It rarely does. That was the problem with family. When they knew you well, their truths arrived faster than your defenses. She works in an office, Ethan said. Single mother, smart, tired, not interested in being impressed. Already like her. I thought you'd say that. And the daughter? Ethan smiled before he meant to. She's 6. Her name is Annie. She proposed to me in a coffee shop. Ben was silent again. Then he burst out laughing so hard Ethan had to move the phone from his ear. I'm sorry, Ben said, still laughing. What? She walked up to my table and asked if I would marry her mother. Ben laughed even harder. Somewhere in the middle of that, Ethan realized he did not mind. In fact, the absurdity of hearing the story spoken aloud made it more precious, not less. When Ben finally regained control of himself, he said, All right. I officially adore this child. She also conducted independent research on my net worth. Ben whistled. Strategic. She's 6. All the truly dangerous ones are. Ethan shook his head, smiling into the dark apartment. Then Ben's voice softened. You like them. It was not a question. Ethan looked again at the city below him, at the lights stretching all the way to the black water. Yes, he said quietly. I do. Then what's the problem? There were many problems. Money. Attention. The fact that Annie was already halfway to hope and children should never be handed instability by adults who mistook curiosity for commitment. The fact that Laura Bennett looked at him like a woman who had no room left in her life for disappointment, and perhaps no patience left for rich men who mistook attraction for intention. The fact that he did not know if he still remembered how to enter someone's life without arriving like a force. She's careful, Ethan said. Sounds healthy. It is. And you're out of practice. That one landed cleanly. Yes. Ben took a breath. Then don't perform. I beg your pardon. Don't do that thing you do. I have no idea what you mean. Yes, you do. The polished version of Ethan. The one who can enter any room, manage any tone, say exactly enough, and never one word too many. Ethan stared out at the glass black lake. Ben continued. That man is excellent in boardrooms. He is exhausting everywhere else. A lesser relationship could not have said that, and survived. But Ben had earned the right years ago. She doesn't need impressive, Ben said. She probably gets enough disappointment from ordinary life. If you're interested, be interested. If you're not, leave them alone before the little girl starts building you into a future. Ethan closed his eyes. There it was. The one line he had been circling since the second day at the cafe. Before the little girl starts building you into a future. Too late for that, he thought. Annie had already drawn the church. Ethan, I'm here. What are you going to do? He looked toward the chair by the window where Claire used to sit with a blanket and a book. feet tucked underneath her, insisting that views were wasted if no one ever paused to appreciate them. Then he thought of Laura in the parking lane beside her old Honda, saying she was impressed by consistency. Not money, not gestures, consistency. Tomorrow mattered because of that word. "I'm going back," he said. Ben made a small approving sound. "To the coffee shop?" "Yes." "Good." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's your wisdom?" "That and one more thing." "What?" "If the child asks you to set a wedding date, maybe slow the process." Ethan laughed again, quieter this time. "Good night, Ben." "Good night." "And Ethan?" "Yes?" "I'm glad you met someone who made you sound alive." The line clicked off before Ethan could answer. He stood there for another long moment, phone still in his hand. Alive. It was a dangerous word. So was hope. So was family, if one had once lost it. But when he finally moved away from the window and into the bedroom, the apartment no longer felt like a museum of a life interrupted. It felt temporary, as though tomorrow had been invited in. Across the city, in a modest apartment with second-hand furniture and too many responsibilities folded into every room, Laura Bennett stood in Annie's doorway, holding a basket of clean laundry she had not yet put away. Annie was already in pajamas, knees tucked under a blanket, the rabbit backpack emptied onto the bed in a chaos of crayons, worksheets, and one library book that had missed its due date by a full week. "You need to sleep," Laura said. "I need to ask one question." That sentence has never once been true. Annie smiled. "Did you like him?" Laura should have answered lightly. He was kind. He was interesting. He was clearly too complicated. Instead, she stayed in the doorway, laundry basket resting against her hip, and told the truth, because children always knew when you didn't. "Yes," she said. Annie's face lit slowly, like sunrise. "I knew it. That does not mean anything." "It means something." Laura crossed the room and set the basket on the chair by the dresser. "It means I had coffee with a man who was polite to my daughter and honest about being lonely." Annie considered that. "That's a start." Laura almost laughed. Maybe it was. She sat down on the edge of the bed and began smoothing the blanket over Annie's legs. In the quiet of the room, the sounds of ordinary life hummed around them. The old refrigerator in the kitchen, a television faintly audible through the apartment wall, pipes ticking somewhere behind plaster. Not glamorous, not tragic, just life. "Mom?" "Yes." "Do you still wear the ring sometimes?" Laura's hands stilled. Children, she thought, always knew where the floor was weakest. "Sometimes. Because you miss him?" "Yes." Annie nodded, accepting that. Then she asked, very softly, "Or because you still want the wedding?" Laura looked at her daughter. At 6 years old, Annie already knew that grief and longing were not the same thing, though they often slept in the same room. "Both," Laura admitted. Annie reached for her hand. "Well," she said drowsily, "maybe love should finish things." Laura felt her throat tighten. That line again. So simple, so merciless. She bent and kissed Annie's forehead. "Sleep, baby." As she turned out the light, she caught sight of the cedar jewelry box on her dresser through the half-open bedroom door. The ring was inside. The old promise, the unfinished life. And somewhere across the city, a man she barely knew had said he would come back tomorrow. For reasons she did not fully trust yet, that mattered. The next afternoon, Ethan arrived at Corner Bean 10 minutes earlier than usual and immediately understood he had made a tactical mistake. Coming early meant waiting. And waiting, he discovered, sharpened expectation into something almost adolescent. He took his usual table by the window, though by now it no longer felt like his table so much as a point of assembly for 3 lives that had begun, however quietly, to lean in the same direction. The barista brought him black coffee without asking, and gave him the sort of knowing smile he had once found intolerable in strangers, and now found merely dangerous. "You're early," she said. "I have a flexible schedule. You have anticipation." Ethan glanced up. "You're remarkably bold for someone handling my caffeine." She laughed and moved back behind the counter. Outside, Chicago moved through another late afternoon shift change. Office workers crossed the street in dark coats and practical shoes, faces tired and inward. Wind rattled a newspaper against a bus stop bench. Overhead, the sky had settled into that pale steel color particular to Midwestern cities in colder months, when the light seemed less like sunshine than a negotiation. Ethan opened his laptop and attempted to answer 3 urgent messages. He failed to answer even one. At 4:32, The door opened and Annie came in at speed, scarf trailing, backpack bouncing, one glove missing. She lost it in the car, Laura said from behind her, already sounding like the end of a longer story. Annie spotted Ethan and stopped short with theatrical delight. "You're here. I was told Thursdays run late." Laura, still holding her purse and a paper folder thick with tabs, gave him a look somewhere between caution and resignation. "Annie has apparently begun sharing my work schedule with civilians." "I'm not a civilian," Ethan said. "That sounds exactly like something a billionaire would say," Laura replied. That earned a delighted cackle from Annie. The barista placed a hot chocolate in front of Annie and a coffee in front of Laura without waiting for orders. Clearly, the entire cafe had accepted this arrangement as a matter of local importance. Laura sat down and exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she said to no one and everyone. "You look tired," Ethan said. "That's because I am." She wrapped both hands around the cup and closed her eyes for one brief second, drawing in the steam like a woman trying to borrow strength from heat. Annie was already unpacking her backpack. Spelling workbook, pencil case, crayons she absolutely did not need for homework but apparently considered essential to survival, a permission slip, a library book, a single sticker in the shape of a yellow star that had somehow attached itself to everything. "I have math first," Annie announced. "Then reading. Then optional coloring." Laura raised a brow. "Coloring becomes optional now? It's growth." Ethan watched the two of them with an attention he did not bother to hide anymore. The choreography of tired motherhood fascinated him. Laura signed the permission slip while checking Annie's workbook. She reminded her to print neatly while fishing a receipt from her purse and tucking it into the folder. She did all of it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been holding a life together alone for longer than anyone should. At one point, Annie pushed the workbook toward Ethan. "Do you know subtraction with regrouping?" Laura looked up immediately. "She is not outsourcing your education to a man she's known for 4 days. It's just math," Annie said. "It's a gateway," Laura replied. Ethan smiled. "I do know subtraction with regrouping." Annie beamed. Laura sighed and surrendered the workbook with the expression of a mother choosing the battle she would lose least badly. "All right," she said. "One problem. 1 row." Annie countered. Laura pinched the bridge of her nose. Ethan took the pencil and glanced at the page. The problem itself was simple. What mattered was Annie's absolute confidence that he would stay and help her solve it. "You borrow from the tens column here," he said, writing neatly. "Then everything becomes easier." Annie studied the page, then him. "So if something is too small, you borrow from the part that has more. That's one way to put it." She nodded as if this confirmed a much larger theory about the universe. Laura watched them both over the rim of her coffee cup. There was no smile on her face. Not exactly, but something more intimate than amusement. Something like wonder held under restraint. The moment might have remained gentle if Annie had not suddenly said, "Did you tell your brother about us?" Laura nearly dropped her pen. Ethan turned slowly. "How?" he asked. "Do you know I have a brother?" Annie shrugged. "People like you always have either a brother or a problem." Laura laughed so hard she had to set down her cup. Ethan stared at Annie, then began laughing too. It was impossible not to. The child's logic was reckless and occasionally flawless. "I do have a brother," he admitted. "I knew it." Laura shook her head. "That answer is too close to right for comfort." Annie returned to her workbook, satisfied. Ethan felt the warmth of the laughter linger even after it passed. He had not expected this. Not the ease, not the rhythm of their conversation, not the way his body had already begun to recognize the hour of day when he'd see them. He looked at Laura. "I did tell him." Her expression shifted. "What did you say?" "That I met someone." Laura did not immediately respond. Her fingers rested on Annie's permission slip, still unsigned. And that she was careful. That drew her eyes fully to his. "That she worked too hard," he continued. "That she had a daughter who was far too perceptive for 6. Annie did not look up. "That's accurate." Laura smiled despite herself. "And what did your brother say?" she asked. Ethan thought of Ben standing in for the kind of blunt honesty family owed each other when everyone else had grown too polite. "He said not to perform." Laura leaned back slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm very good at being impressive when I'm uncertain." She considered that. "And now?" He met her gaze. "Now I'm trying not to be." Something quiet passed between them then, something Annie mercifully did not interrupt because she had entered the serious stage of reading comprehension and was mouthing the questions under her breath. Laura looked down at her coffee. That's probably wise. I thought so. She nodded once, then said in a softer voice, For what it's worth, I don't think you've been performing. That mattered more than it should have. Ethan did not trust himself to answer immediately. For years, most people had only seen the version of him built for boardrooms and headlines. Even with Claire, especially toward the end, work had trained him into a kind of polished detachment he had mistaken for competence. Laura Bennett, in less than a week, had begun asking for the man underneath it, and he wanted, with a sudden clarity that unsettled him, to be equal to that request. Annie slammed her pencil down. I'm done. Laura checked the page. This says, the dog ran because he had important business. Yes, that was a reading comprehension question. It is a complete sentence. Ethan laughed into his coffee. Laura gave him a look. You're encouraging this. I'm admiring the confidence. It's not always an asset. It is if you're planning strategic social interventions in cafes, he said. Annie smiled slyly over the top of her workbook. Laura looked from him to her daughter and then out the window, where the tower lights across the street were flickering on floor by floor. I should tell you something, she said. Her tone changed enough that Ethan straightened slightly. What is it? She hesitated, and he could see the choice in her face, the calculation of whether honesty here would complicate things or protect them. Then she said, Tomorrow there's a family breakfast at Annie's school. Annie grimaced. It's dumb. It's not dumb, Laura said automatically. It's pancakes with awkward questions. Laura ignored that. I was going to take a late start from work, she continued. Usually it's not a problem. But one of our auditors moved a review to tomorrow morning, and my manager made it very clear, attendance is not optional. Ethan listened quietly. I can still go, she said, though the strain in her voice suggested she already knew the cost of that claim. It'll just mean an hour there, an hour commuting, and trying not to look like I'm abandoning a fire at the office. Annie stared at the workbook. Some kids have 2 people come, she said. The sentence was quiet. Too quiet. Laura's face changed immediately. Sweetheart, I know, Annie said. It's fine. But children only said it's fine in that tone when it very much was not. Ethan glanced at Laura. She looked trapped in the exact kind of no-win choice motherhood offered every day. Let your child down a little or let everything else collapse a little and hope neither cost too much. Before he had fully thought it through, he heard himself say, What time is the breakfast? Laura looked up sharply. Annie's head lifted. Ethan, Laura said carefully, you do not need to solve this. I know. He held her gaze. But I could come. The words seemed to stop time at the table. Annie went perfectly still. Laura stared at him, searching his face with the intensity of someone trying to decide whether generosity had just entered the room or danger wearing a good suit. It's just breakfast, he said gently. If Annie wants someone there. Annie's eyes were suddenly so bright they almost hurt to look at. Laura did not answer right away. Because the offer was kind, yes. But kindness, when it arrived at the wrong speed, could also become risk. Laura did not answer right away. She sat very still, one hand resting on Annie's workbook, the other around her cooling coffee cup, and looked at Ethan as though the offer itself had weight she needed to measure before she dared touch it. Across from her, Annie had gone so quiet it was almost impressive. For a 6-year-old, silence was either deep concentration or deep hope. This was hope. It's just breakfast, Ethan said again, more softly now. If that would help. Laura lowered her eyes for a second. The cafe hummed around them. A man near the counter laughed into his phone. The espresso machine hissed. Outside the window, the city carried on under a pale evening sky that had already begun surrendering to night. When she looked up again, her face held the same careful intelligence he had come to recognize in her. That's kind, she said. But I need to think about whether it's wise. Annie finally breathed. That means maybe. Laura turned to her daughter. That means I'm your mother, and I get to answer in full sentences before you announce a verdict. Annie nodded solemnly, then looked at Ethan and whispered, It means maybe. He smiled despite himself. Laura rubbed her forehead lightly. The problem, she said, now speaking to Ethan, is not the breakfast itself. The problem is that once a child begins counting on something, It stops being a small thing. He nodded once. I know. She studied his face, as if testing whether he truly did. My work can be unpredictable, she continued. Life can be unpredictable. Annie's used to me managing that. She is not used to, she paused, to anyone else showing up. There it was. Not accusation, not challenge, just the truth, laid down between them, where neither of them could politely step around it. Ethan felt the weight of it land exactly where it should. And if I say yes, Laura said, I'm not saying yes to a nice gesture. I'm saying yes to a memory she'll keep. Annie stared at her hot chocolate, not because the subject embarrassed her, because she knew her mother was right. Ethan leaned back slightly, his coffee untouched now. I understand, he said quietly. And if the answer is no, I'll understand that too. Laura held his gaze. That mattered, not just the offer, but the lack of pressure behind it. In his world, powerful men often mistook access for generosity. They solved things because they could, then expected gratitude as a kind of currency. Laura had likely spent years avoiding that kind of help in offices, in friendships, maybe even in family. Ethan was suddenly aware that if he moved 1 inch too fast, she would retreat, and not because she disliked him, but because she loved Annie more than she was willing to risk. Annie slid off her chair. Can I go look at the muffins? Laura blinked. You mean by yourself? I can still see you from there. Laura looked toward the pastry case, then back at her daughter. 3 minutes. No touching anything. No bargaining with adults. Annie nodded as if these terms were perfectly reasonable and hurried off. The moment she was out of earshot, Laura let out a breath. She knows when to leave a conversation, Ethan said. She knows when she's in one too big for her. He watched Annie pause in front of the pastry case, hands clasped behind her back, studying each option as if making a financial investment. She's remarkable, he said. Laura's face softened instantly. She is. Then, after a brief pause, she added, she's also 6, which means she can recover from a lot and still remember all of it. That was the sentence that mattered most. Ethan nodded. I don't want to become something unstable in her life. Laura looked at him then, and for the first time there was no caution in her expression, only plain exhaustion and plain honesty. That's the first thing you've said all week that makes me believe you really understand my hesitation. He accepted that without defense. Fair enough. She looked down into her coffee. When Annie was 3, Laura said, there was a man I dated for a few months. Nothing serious. Or at least I thought it wasn't serious. Ethan listened without moving. I was very careful. He didn't meet her right away. I waited. I told myself I was being smart. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. He was charming. Reliable in the beginning. The kind of man who brought oranges when Annie had a cold, and remembered I liked my coffee with too much cream. And then, Laura smiled without humor, and then he discovered that being with a woman who had a child required more patience than admiring the idea of it. Ethan said nothing. He left, she said simply. Not cruelly, not dramatically. He just stopped stepping forward. He had seen that kind of failure before men who liked proximity to responsibility when it made them feel generous, then withdrew the moment it demanded consistency. How long? He asked. Long enough for her to ask where he went. That landed hard. Laura's eyes stayed on the coffee. She wasn't devastated, she said. She was confused. Which, in some ways, is worse. Across the cafe, Annie pointed excitedly at a blueberry muffin, and then seemed to remember she wasn't allowed to bargain. She pressed her lips together and resumed silently evaluating pastry options. Laura followed Ethan's gaze. She bounced back, she said. Kids do. Sometimes, Ethan replied. Laura looked at him. Yes, she said quietly. Sometimes. The space between them shifted again. This was no longer about breakfast. Not really. It was about whether the man sitting across from her understood the difference between showing up and staying. Ethan had spent much of his life being excellent at beginnings, launching companies, entering rooms, capturing interest. The middle was harder. Consistency was harder. And yet, sitting here with Laura Bennett, while her daughter seriously contemplated baked goods, he felt a desire so unfamiliar it startled him. Not to impress, to deserve trust. I can't promise you something broad and beautiful after a week, he said. Laura did not look away. I'm not asking for broad and beautiful. No, he said. You're asking for honest and durable. Something in her face shifted, not because the words were perfect, because they were true. Yes, she said. Annie came back then, settling into her chair with the gravity of someone returning from diplomatic reconnaissance. The blueberry muffin has integrity, she announced. Laura blinked. I'm sorry? It looks dependable. Ethan looked down at the table to hide a smile. Laura gave up and rubbed her temple. This is my life now. It's a strong vocabulary, Ethan offered. It's emotional chaos with grammar. Annie pointed at them both. Did you decide? Laura straightened. No one has decided anything yet. Did you at least discuss the possibility of deciding something later? Ethan laughed. Laura turned to him. Please do not encourage this. It's difficult, he admitted. She phrases things like opposing counsel. Annie looked proud. Laura sipped her coffee, then set the cup down with deliberate care. All right, she said. Annie froze. Ethan did too, though less visibly. Laura turned first to Annie. If Ethan comes tomorrow, it is because he is being kind and because I have to work. It is not a promise of anything bigger than breakfast. Annie opened her mouth. Laura raised one finger. It is not a proposal update. It is not destiny. It is not a reason to tell your class anything dramatic. Annie considered this. Can I still wear my purple sweater? Laura stared at her, then laughed despite every effort not to. Yes, she said. You may still wear your purple sweater. Then she looked at Ethan. If you come, you're just a friend having breakfast with us before school. Nothing more complicated than that. He met her gaze steadily. I can do that. The answer came more easily than he expected, because it wasn't just breakfast, but it was enough. Enough to begin where she needed him to begin. Annie clasped both hands under her chin. This is wonderful. Laura gave her a look. It is breakfast. It is progress, Annie corrected. Ethan could not argue. Outside, the last of the evening light thinned along the edges of the city. Inside the cafe, the table felt smaller now, not cramped, just closer, as if some distance had been crossed that none of them could entirely measure. Laura checked the time and began gathering Annie's things. Finish your drink. I did. You inhaled whipped cream. That's not the same. Annie obediently reached for the mug. Laura slid the workbook into the backpack, tucked in the permission slip, and added the construction paper family history page with unusual care. Ethan watched her hands. Practical hands. Tired hands. Careful hands. He wondered what it would take for her to stop bracing against every possible disappointment. He wondered whether she ever allowed herself to imagine joy without immediately measuring the cost. At the door, Annie paused and turned back to him. 7:30, she said. Laura Seahilled. The school starts at 7:45. That means 7:30. Ethan nodded. I'll be there. Laura looked at him then, and in that look was all the risk of the moment. Gratitude, caution, hope, held so tightly it barely looked like hope at all. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Laura. Good night, Annie said, then added in a fierce whisper. And wear something that says dependable. Laura nearly dropped the backpack. Ethan laughed all the way back to the window after they left, and standing there, watching mother and daughter disappear into the city's evening rush, he felt something he had not felt in years. Not certainty. Something much more fragile. Something worth protecting. A beginning. Ethan arrived at Annie's school at 7:28, which was 2 minutes earlier than necessary and 10 minutes earlier than he had told himself he would allow. He had chosen his clothes with an absurd amount of thought for a man who usually dressed for board meetings without looking in a mirror longer than 10 seconds. Dark wool coat, clean white shirt, navy sweater instead of a tie. Dependable, Annie had said. He smiled to himself as he parked and stepped out into the cold Chicago morning. The school was a sturdy brick elementary building with a flag snapping in the wind and a line of minivans idling at the curb. Parents hurried children toward the entrance carrying casserole dishes, paper trays of muffins, and travel mugs of coffee. The annual family breakfast banner hung slightly crooked over the front doors, as if put up in a hurry by volunteers who had long ago accepted that perfection was not part of public school life. Ethan stood for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the building. He had not been inside an elementary school in over 30 years, and never like this. Not as a donor, not for a ribbon cutting, not for a photo opportunity with a principal and a giant check. Just a man showing up because a little girl needed one more chair filled at a table. That difference mattered more than he expected. Inside, The cafeteria glowed with fluorescent lights and the soft chaos of early morning. Folding tables were covered in paper cloths, construction paper turkeys and snowflakes left over from different seasons, somehow still taped to walls, gave the room an endearing sense of civic exhaustion. Coffee urns steamed beside trays of scrambled eggs, sausage links, pancakes, and fruit cups. Children darted between adults in sneakers and winter boots, voices bouncing off the high ceiling. Annie spotted him before he saw her. "Mom!" He came. The joy in her voice carried across the room like a bell. Ethan turned. Annie was standing beside one of the long cafeteria tables in a purple sweater, exactly as promised. Her blonde curls half contained by a headband she had probably objected to wearing. Laura stood beside her in a charcoal coat, travel mug in one hand and a paper plate in the other. For one brief second, the look on Laura's face was almost impossible to read. Relief came first, then surprise that relief had arrived at all, then something softer, something that made the whole cold morning feel warmer. Ethan crossed the cafeteria toward them. "Good morning," he said. Annie nearly launched herself at him, then seemed to remember she was in public and settled for grabbing his hand with both of hers. "You came. I said I would." Laura looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "You did." He heard the meaning underneath it. "You said you would. And you did." For a woman who valued consistency over charm, that was no small thing. Annie tugged him toward the table. "There's pancakes," she said, "and bad orange juice. And these eggs that Mom says are not really eggs, but are trying their best." Laura sighed. "I said institutional eggs have limitations." "That's what I said." Ethan laughed softly. The three of them moved through the breakfast line together, and the ordinariness of it hit him with startling force. Annie chose pancakes and strawberries with grave precision. Laura took coffee, fruit, and one piece of dry toast she clearly would not finish. Ethan, who could have had breakfast sent to any private office in the city, stood in line with a paper tray while two second graders argued over syrup packets behind him. It felt absurd. It felt human. It felt good. They sat at a table near the back of the cafeteria. For a few minutes, the morning moved in a simple rhythm. Annie narrated school gossip. Laura checked her phone once, frowned at an email, then deliberately put it face down on the table. Ethan cut Annie's pancakes when the plastic knife failed her. Laura thanked him with a glance rather than words. Then the room shifted, not loudly, not all at once, just enough that he noticed heads turning. A man near the coffee station looked twice. A woman in a camel coat whispered something to the parent beside her. Recognition moved through the room the way it always did around him. First uncertainty, then confirmation, then all the small social tremors of status entering an ordinary place. Laura noticed too. Her shoulders changed, not dramatically, just enough. Annie, mercifully, was too busy telling Ethan why the school librarian was secretly the most powerful person in the building. The principal approached with the careful smile of a man who had just realized one of the wealthiest people in Illinois was eating cafeteria eggs under a paper snowflake. "Mr. Carter," he said. "What a surprise." Ethan stood automatically and shook his hand. "Good morning. I'm Principal Henderson. We're honored to have you here." Laura's face went still. She looked from the principal to Ethan, then back to her coffee. Ethan understood immediately. This was the part she hated, the part where money entered the room and rearranged it. He kept his voice even. "I'm here with Annie and Laura." Principal Henderson smiled too brightly. Of course. Well, if there's anything you need, we're all set," Ethan said gently, but with enough finality that the principal understood he had been dismissed without insult. When the man moved on, silence settled over the table. Annie looked at her mother. Laura set down her fork. "So," she said quietly, "your school fundraiser famous too." Ethan met her gaze. "I was hoping for at least 15 more minutes before that became relevant." Annie looked between them. "Is this bad?" Laura exhaled. "No, sweetheart. Not bad. Just complicated," her expression said. At the next table, a woman Ethan vaguely recognized from some charity board gave him a wide, practiced smile. He ignored it. Laura noticed that too. "You could be over there," she said softly, "being congratulated for existing. I'd rather be here." She looked at him carefully. This morning had been a test long before anyone said it aloud. Not just whether he would come, whether he would stay once the room remembered who he was. Annie swung her legs under the table and whispered, "I'm glad you're here." Ethan turned to her. "So am I." A little later, the teacher in charge announced that children could take their grown-ups to see classroom art projects before the first bell. Annie shot out of her chair. "Come on." Laura rose more slowly, gathering napkins and trays with the ingrained habit of someone who cleaned up as she moved through life. Ethan reached for the stack of paper plates before she could. "I can get those." She let him. Another small thing. Another way of saying, "I see how much you carry." In Annie's classroom, construction paper self-portraits lined the walls. A reading rug with faded stars covered the floor. Tiny desks held sharpened pencils and laminated name tags. Annie proudly showed Ethan her spelling test, her drawing corner, her cubby, and a paper heart, with the sentence, "Family is who shows up," written in careful first-grade print. He stared at that sentence longer than he meant to. Laura came to stand beside him. "She wrote that last week," she said quietly. "It's true." "Yes," Laura replied, and her voice held more than agreement. It held exhaustion, gratitude, fear, longing, all the things adults learn to compress into one syllable when they no longer trusted life to be simple. Annie tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Come see the family wall." It was a bulletin board filled with photographs and student drawings. Annie's page was near the center. The same family history project she had shown him in the cafe was pinned there, only neater now, framed by blue construction paper. "My dad was going to marry my mom. He got sick and died before the wedding. My mom still kept the ring. I think love should finish things." Several parents were nearby, reading the projects while pretending not to. One woman gave Laura a look Ethan knew too well, pity dressed as politeness. He saw Laura straighten against it, not ashamed, just tired of being observed through the lens of what she had lost. Annie looked up at him, then at the wall, then at her mother, and in a voice soft enough to belong to them alone, she said, "Maybe it can." Laura turned. The first bell rang then, sharp and bright through the hallway. Children groaned. Adults checked watches. The ordinary spell of the morning began to break. Laura knelt to button Annie's coat. "Big day," she said. "I know. You have reading group after lunch. I know. And no correcting adults unless they truly deserve it." Annie smiled. "I know." Laura kissed her forehead. Then Annie turned to Ethan. Without any hesitation, she wrapped both arms around him. It was quick, small, completely sincere. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. He felt the trust of it like a hand around his heart. "You're welcome, Annie." She ran off toward her desk just before the teacher shooed the adults toward the door. In the hallway, parents scattered back into workdays and traffic and obligations. Laura and Ethan walked more slowly. At the front doors, morning cold waited for them again. Laura stopped before they stepped outside. "I almost told you no," she said. "I know. I almost decided it was too risky. That would have been fair." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said the thing that mattered most. "But you came anyway." Ethan held her gaze. Yes, the world did not change visibly in that instant. No music rose. No miracle occurred. The city remained gray and practical and impatient beyond the school doors. But something quieter happened. Something stronger. Laura reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded note. "It's my number," she said. His breath caught, just slightly. "In case," she added. "You ever want coffee when Annie isn't negotiating the terms?" He took the paper carefully. "I'd like that." Laura nodded once, as if confirming something to herself rather than to him. Then, because real life was always more modest than fantasy, she glanced at her watch and muttered, "And now I have 12 minutes to get downtown and pretend I wasn't emotionally ambushed by pancakes." He laughed. She did too. And before she turned toward the parking lot, she said, very softly, "Thank you for showing up." This time, he knew she meant more than breakfast. When she walked away, Ethan stood in the cold morning holding a folded piece of paper in one hand and the strange, steady certainty of beginning in the other. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like a board calendar full of obligations. It felt like an invitation. This story reminds us that love does not always arrive in grand or perfect moments. Sometimes it begins with a small act of kindness, a simple conversation, or the courage of a child who believes people should not face life alone. Annie's innocent question shows that children often see truth more clearly than adults. Loneliness can be healed when people choose to show up for one another. The story teaches us that real love is not about wealth, status, or perfect timing. It is about consistency, compassion, and the bravery to open your heart again after loss. In the end, family is not only the one we are born into, but the one we build by choosing each other every day. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.